Hello everybody, Realm Builder Guy here, and welcome back to the channel and a new series for a new game here on the channel. Not too long ago, I put out a little review about Strategic Command WW1. In case you missed that, don't forget to check that one out. In this first episode of my Strategic Command WW1 series, I'm going to kind of lay the groundwork for this series. I don't know how long the series is going to go because, well, I haven't played thousands of hours in this game. I have played quite a few, and it's a lot of fun, but what I'm planning on doing might not go so well, but I think we'll have fun along the way. I'm going to lay some groundwork. I'm going to talk a little bit about the strategy, but of course, first I want to set up the world in 1914 and talk a little bit about my favorite subject, which is history. So the game begins August 1st, 1914. Now, as many of you know, the war officially started July 28th, 1914. On August 1st, 1914, Russia declared war on Germany. Now, the precursor to the war that broke out on July 28th was, of course, as we all know, the June 28th, 1914 assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary by Serbian anarchists who were tied with the Black Hand in Sarajevo. But there's more to it that led to this conflict. A conflict that, A, could have been avoided, and B, set the stage for absolutely everything that followed in the 20th century. I mean, if we think about the Weimar Republic, World War II, and the Cold War, and all the ramifications therefrom, the Korean War, Vietnam War, the conflicts in Africa and Latin America, and so on and so forth, World War I was really the spark for all of those things that happened and the conclusion of World War I as well. So what was the setting like here in the summer of 1914, the summer where we begin our adventure as the Central Powers here on Strategic Command World War I? Well, we had an ever-changing society with a growth in fervent nationalism. Germany had become the cultural and industrial powerhouse of Europe, which made France and Britain rather unhappy. Germany also allied and had very close ties with Austria since 1879. Of course, just 13 years prior to that, defeating Austria in the Austro-Prussian War that gave Prussia the power to then take on France and really become the leading force of the German states. Now, Austria at this time is a bit inept and is ruled by 84-year-old Franz Joseph I, who'd been on the throne since the middle of the 19th century. In 1908, one key thing that happened was down in this region right here, and that is when Austria-Hungary annexed Bosnia-Herzegovina, which enraged the neighbor right here in Serbia, and of course the Ottomans and the other Slavic nations around it, as well as Russia, and honestly most of Europe. Even the Germans weren't overly fond of that. Now on top of that, you have a financially strapped Austria at this time. It is bloated, it is multinational, it has multiple official national languages. I mean, it's a lot going on in Austria-Hungary at that time. On top of that, we have so many different alliances we're dealing with. And let me just go out here to this much larger map to show it. You, one, have the Triple Alliance with Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Now, France has kind of had an issue with Germany for quite a long time, specifically since the Franco-Prussian War of 1871. France is allied with the United Kingdom at this time, but they're not really friendly. In fact, I read somewhere that both Britain and France were drawing up plans around the turn of the century of, well, what if we invade the other country? So, sometimes, the 100 Years' War never goes away. Now, Bismarck had brought Germany close with Russia, and the reason why, and this was called the Holy Alliance, in fact, with Russia, because the Russian Tsar and the German Kaiser were closely related. as was apparently everybody at this time. But Bismarck did this because he wanted to avoid a multi-front war. He wasn't too worried about the Austrians anymore. He wasn't too worried about these guys down here in France anymore because they had already beaten them. He was worried about Britain because Britain was so strong, and he was worried about Russia because he knew the reserves, the manpower reserves, Russia could muster. So getting a close alliance with them would be very important. But after Bismarck left, Germany became more antagonistic against Russia, and that led to the alliance between Russia and France. And then eventually in 1907, that alliance turned into the Triple Entente, when our friends across the channel here in the United Kingdom joined France and Russia. So we're setting up some things here. In this time, Germany actually became closer with the Ottomans, which of course threatened Russian trade interests. Well, why? Because I think it's 80-90% of all Russian grain shipments went right past Constantinople. So definitely something the Russians didn't like, that the German cousins and the Ottomans were close, given also the fact that Russia and the Ottomans had quite a few conflicts over the centuries. Russia supported the Slavic nations in this region, which then led to tensions with both the Austrians and the Ottomans. In particular, Russia was very close with Serbia. Now, tensions between the Germans and the British also rose, mainly because, well, Kaiser Wilhelm wanted a strong navy because they believed, correctly so, that a lot of the international and colonial dominance of Britain was down to its naval power. And of course, that was one key aspect. And he wanted that. And what this did was actually ate up about a third of Germany's defense budget was dedicated to the Navy. And as you can see here on the map, we've got a lot of naval units. Now, the British didn't like that, of course, because it threatened their interests, both in Europe and abroad. And in fact, Winston Churchill proposed that neither side build further in their navy, which, of course, the Germans decided to ignore. But the main powder keg during this time, which honestly isn't new, it was a powder keg for quite a few centuries, was between Austria, Hungary, and the Slavic nations of the Balkans. Now, the Balkan nations at this time only recently had become independent from Ottoman rule. In fact, Serbia became independent in 1878. Now, Serbia was relatively isolated due to the instability of the region. None of the other major powers really wanted to touch it, except the Russians stayed close to them because they knew this could hurt Ottoman interests in the region. So again, Russia kind of put itself in a bit of a pickle there. Now, the Black Hand was very strong in Serbia and actually had agents within the Serbian government. And they destabilized the region through their acts of, well, assassination and terrorism at times. Now, the Ottomans were very, very weak at this time, and what was proven was in the middle of the 19th century and into the 1870s when they lost Libya to Italy. And Italy at that time isn't actually a nation for that many years. This led to the Balkan Wars and the creation of the Balkan League against the Ottomans. The Balkan League, who is that? Those are Serbia, Montenegro, Greece, Bulgaria, to drive out the Ottomans. And who supported them? Russia. Why? Because Russian interests were helped if the Ottomans were weak. Now, Bulgaria dropped out of the Balkan League pretty quickly because they weren't happy. They thought Serbia and Greece got more out of the deal. Serbia actually occupied Albania for a while until the Austrians said, get out or, there could be war. So the Serbians obliged. The Balkan League eventually collapsed, and only Serbia was left in this Balkan League with the support of the Russians. And Austria-Hungary saw Serbia as one of their biggest threats to national security and national interests. So again, that meant Russia was a problem. Now, Russia was eager at this time to redeem itself after military losses to the Japanese in 1905, and of course the Bosnian annexation in 1908 was kind of a thorn in their side, given that they were trying to cultivate those close relations with the Slavic nations in the Balkans. Now, one of the problems we have, and I said I'd kind of get back to the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, Franz Ferdinand was generally not liked across Europe or even within Austria-Hungary itself. But he actually didn't want a war with Russia. In fact, he was so against a war with Russia, he was pushing for a tripartite Austrian Empire, Austria, Hungary, and the Slavic nations of the Balkan, and working closely with the Serbians, even though, he didn't really like the Serbs, but he felt in the national interest of Austria-Hungary, they had to work closer together. So when he died, the Serbians' biggest ally kind of went away, and that left an Austrian military leadership that was both hawkish and incompetent at the time. But it's not all about Austria. Of course, Germany, well, they didn't cover themselves in glory either. In 1912, actually, Kaiser Wilhelm said that if there's a Balkan war for Austria, then it must quickly defeat Serbia before the Russians invade, because he knew Russian military power was an issue. Now, Russia is not a backwater. It actually had a pretty good infrastructure at the time, and the German military leadership saw Russia as the greatest military threat to German interests. Kaiser Wilhelm at the time didn't really expect a war, so when we were in the summer of 1914, everyone was pretty chill. Now, the other thing that I alluded to, Germany wanted to avoid war with Britain. So, they knew British military might and naval power would be a problem, and they were pretty close. They actually liked each other, and again, a lot of the royal houses of Europe were related. Now, in case there would be a war, one of the theories that was put out in the early 20th century came from a certain von Schlieffen. And of course, this is the von Schlieffen Plan. Now, the von Schlieffen Plan, and von Schlieffen was the head of the German military from 1891 till 1905, said in case of a war with Russia and France, due to that alliance, they had to knock out France first, and they had to do it quickly so they can focus everything on Russia, and ideally they knock France out of the war within 6 weeks. The goal of the von Schlieffen Plan, in case you didn't know it, would be to sweep through Holland, or the Netherlands, and Belgium, and then kind of attack Paris from the north and sweep up the heavily fortified French forces along the German border. A few years before the war, they decided we're going to ignore the Netherlands because the Netherlands was a very important trading partner for Germany, so instead they would just focus on Belgium if war happened. And again, nobody really thought war was going to happen. The problem, of course, being sweeping through Belgium meant that you could bring in the British because Britain had a treaty with Belgium, and if Belgium was attacked, then Britain would go to war. And everybody knew this. In fact, the British told both France and Germany, please don't attack Belgium. If you do, you will force our hand. Now, France, on the other hand, was very motivated to go to war with Germany because they wanted to get revenge for the loss during the Franco-Prussian War in 1871, so just 43 years earlier. And that still stung a bit in the national psyche of France. So on August 1st, we have the declaration of war against Germany from Russia. On top of that, on August 3rd, France came in, but Kaiser Wilhelm only wanted to focus on Russia. Well, von Moltke was against that, mainly due to the troop positions in the West. And you can see that right here. We got a lot of German troops right here in the West. And if we head on over to the Eastern Front, not so much. So von Moltke said, no, we're sticking to the von Schlieffen Plan. We're going to kind of sacrifice the East until we wrap up the French pretty quickly. And then we can go back and take care of the Russians, because they thought, von Moltke did, that it would take a while for the Russians to mobilize. Of course, we all know how it all went. That wasn't quite the case. And this war really, it was a true humanitarian disaster. So what is my strategy? What do I plan on doing here in Strategic Command World War I as the Central Powers? Now, first of all, if we look at the Central Powers, we will go to the diplomacy screen. Right now, it is just Germany and Austria-Hungary. The Ottoman Empire has not yet entered the war. Now, they are leaning 20%, So when they get to 100%, then they're in the war. 20%, they are leaning towards the Central Powers. We have the British are 75% ready for war, and they are leaning towards the Entente by 75%. Of course, Canada, they are already 100% committed to Entente through the UK. Egypt, 100% committed to the war via the UK. France is leaning that way. Of course, India is leaning that way. Portugal is leaning that way. The domino here is the UK. Italy is like, I mean, they're 0%. They're in the middle, even though they're part of the Triple Alliance. The United States is not in here. Albania is not in here. Belgium leaning towards the Entente due to the UK. Greece is also leaning Entente due to the UK. And then, of course, France and Russia are already committed to the war at this point in the game. Up for grabs are still the Netherlands and Norway leaning towards the Central Powers, as are Sweden and Switzerland. Spain is neutral at this point. Persia is neutral. And Romania is leaning towards the Entente due to Russian influence. So, what I want to do is play out the scenario of what if no Schlieffenplan? In fact, what if Kaiser Wilhelm had stuck to his guts and said, no, we're not. We need to focus on Russia. We want to avoid war with Britain, which we know the von Schlieffen Plan will trigger a war with Britain. The UK will come in the moment we declare war against Belgium. We can hold off the French. They are dug in here. If we dig in here, we can kind of just hold them at bay. So what if we do a reverse von Schlieffen Plan? An Eastern von Schlieffen Plan, and we ignore Moltke and pretend Kaiser Wilhelm ignored von Moltke. And instead we focus all of our efforts on the Russian front, on the Eastern Front, in trying to defeat Russia as fast as possible. Now, part of that will also come down to our Austrian allies. They can come from the south, and we can kind of amass our forces here and kind of have the Austrians sweep up from the south, we sweep up from the north, and then drive centrally. In fact, we could even have a weakened opening here in the middle to pull the Russians in and then kind of sweep in from north and south and then drive as many of these forces in here as possible. We can also concentrate our navy on the Baltic Sea and try to completely destroy the Russian navy in the meantime. Now, one of the key things, and Kaiser Wilhelm was right, the Austrians have to knock out Serbia as fast as possible. So one of the goals here will be to blitz, even though that didn't really exist at that time, that term, into Serbia and take Belgrade and knock out the Serbians as fast as absolutely possible. It's going to be a little hard because the Austrian military is rather inept and weak. It's kind of like playing Strategic Command, World War II, War in Europe, and you're dealing with the Italian military. I just had a campaign with that just on my own, and whew, that was tough at times. But anyway, the other thing we need to do is we need to invest in diplomacy to bring the Ottomans in here. Now, you can see we've got mines all throughout here, but bringing in and having the Ottomans mobilize means there will be another front for the Russians to deal with and attacking from here. We got to keep an eye on Bulgaria and Albania as well, and maybe try to get them on our side as much as possible because we can destabilize the Serbs in that time. Keep an eye on the Greeks, because Romania could also join the war, and of course then they have an open front here. The other one we need to try diplomatically to keep on our side is Italy, but that's going to be rather difficult. Switzerland, I assume, will stay neutral. Scandinavia is a key convoy hub for us. If I look at the convoy maps here real quick, we can see all the blue lines are the convoys coming in for the Central Powers in Germany. We have a Norwegian, a Swedish, and a Danish convoy. And then we've got this convoy in between Germany and Austria. But we've got 10 MPPs coming in from Denmark, 30 from Sweden, and 18 from Norway. These will be very important to protect these against raiders both from Russia and Britain and France. And then on top of that, we need to move maybe via this way, because if we mobilize in the North Sea, Britain, there's a high chance they could enter the war. But if we kind of station some ships up here, specifically U-Boote, submarines, and then if Britain enters the war, sweep down here and disrupt their convoys, well, that would be one major strategy. So I hope you will join me in this adventure with Strategic Command World War I and the Central Powers and the No Schlieffen Plan. It could go horribly wrong. It could be really bad, but I figured this would be an interesting way to see how World War I could have played out had von Moltke been silenced, or at least silenced. That sounds nefarious. But if Kaiser Wilhelm II would have instead said, no, I'm sticking to my guns, we're going to focus just on Russia, we're going to avoid a war with Britain at all costs, and just kind of maintain the French as long as possible. If we then do disrupt Russia enough to knock them out of the war, well then we're going to sweep into France any which way possible, and then I won't care that much anymore because we only have a one-front war. So let me know your thoughts on this series, on the game, and on the No Schlieffen plan. So until next time, and don't forget to hit the like button, I'm Realm Builder Guy, and I will talk to you soon.